For 14 months, the boy did not speak. Not to the specialists who examined his throat twice a year and found nothing wrong with it. Not to the 11 nannies who came through the iron gate on Seoul's quietest, most guarded street and left within weeks, some of them crying, some of them simply gone by morning with their severance already wired to an account they hadn't given the number for yet. Not even to his father, a man who could make a shipping conglomerate change course with one phone call and a city council look the other way with one signature, but who could not make his own son say a single word. Then a woman filled out a form under a name that was not her own, walked through a gate that was never supposed to open for her, and hummed 6 notes she had known her whole life without knowing they had belonged to a dead woman first.
Welcome to K-Drama Afro Tales. Hit that like button right now. Drop your seat in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because what happened in that house didn't just wake a boy up. It woke up a secret that had been buried in a closet in Baltimore for 6 years, waiting for someone to finally open the right box.
The rain in Seoul that October fell the way it always fell on Yonghwi-dong, quietly and expensively, the kind of rain that seemed to know it was being absorbed by cobblestone driveways that cost more per square foot than most apartments in the city. Han Seo-jun stood at the window of his study on the 2nd floor of a house too large for the 2 people who lived in it, and watched a black sedan idle at the gate for the 3rd time that month, waiting for a woman it would eventually take away again. He did not go down to meet her. He had stopped doing that around the 5th one. The house on Yonghwi-dong's furthest curve, behind a wall high enough that neighbors joked it had its own weather, had absorbed 11 nannies in 14 months, and Seo-jun had learned there was no version of watching them leave that made the next arrival easier to hope about. He had hope managed his way through grief before. He knew what it cost to keep doing something that kept failing, and he had decided, somewhere around nanny number 7, that he would simply stop attending the departures. He would read the exit report Mrs. Beck prepared, always some version of the same 3 sentences. The boy does not respond to verbal prompts. The boy does not initiate contact. The boy watches the door more than he watches the person in the room. And he would sign the placement agency's next contract without reading past the fee schedule, because reading the biography section had started to feel like a form of self-harm. He no longer let himself imagine, before he met them, that this one might be different. He had run out of the specific kind of stupidity that hope required. He was 37 years old. He had buried 4 rivals in the years it took to consolidate the territory his father left him, had sat across negotiating tables from men who wanted him dead and men who wanted to be him, and had built, on top of the enterprise his father called the family business and everyone else quietly called the syndicate, a second structure entirely, baked a group, shipping and logistics and private equity, glass towers in Gangnam with his name on the deed and none of it, on paper, connected to anything that would interest a prosecutor. He had done all of this with the particular cold competence that had made him, by 29, the youngest chairman in the group's history and, by 32, a man whose silence in a room did more work than most men's shouting. None of it had prepared him for a 6-year-old who would not speak. His son's name was Ji-ho. He had been 5 when it happened, was 6 now, would turn 7 in March, and somewhere in the 14 months since the accident on the coastal road outside Soksho, he had simply stopped using his voice, the way a light switch stops working, not broken exactly, still present, still wired into the wall, just refusing the current. The doctors had a name for it. Selective mutism, trauma adjacent, not uncommon in cases of acute loss, typically resolves with time and the correct therapeutic environment. And Seo-jun had listened to 4 different specialists explain the mechanism to him in 4 different offices with 4 different views of the Han River, and had understood every word and been able to do nothing at all with any of them, because knowing the name of a wall did not make it any less a wall. Ji-ho ate. He slept, mostly, though not well. He drew, obsessively, the same shape over and over in a sketchbook Mrs. Beck kept refilling. A car, always a car, sometimes with 2 headlights and sometimes with 4. The extra pair positioned behind the first set at a distance that made Seo-jun's chest tighten every time he saw a new page, though no doctor had been able to tell him what it meant, only that it likely meant something, that children processed catastrophic memory in symbol before they processed it in language, if they processed it at all. Ji-ho attended the private academy 3 days a week where a specialist worked with him one-on-one in a room with soft walls and no windows, per Seo-jun's specific instruction, because Ji-ho had started, in the months after the accident, to flinch at glass. He did not speak there either. He pointed. He nodded. He had a system of small gestures that the specialist had learned to read, and Seo-jun envied that woman more than he'd ever admit to envying anyone because she got 50 minutes twice a week of a version of his son that he did not get at all. The 11th nanny had lasted 19 days. She had been a woman in her 50s, highly credentialed, references from 2 ambassadorial households, and she had come to Seoul on the 19th evening with the particular careful diplomacy of someone delivering a resignation they'd rehearsed in the car, and told him that she did not think she was the right fit, that the boy needed something she did not know how to provide, that she was very sorry, that she hoped he found the right person soon. She had not said the thing he suspected she was actually thinking, which was that the house itself was wrong for a grieving child, too large, too quiet in the specific way that money bought quiet, too full of staff who moved through it with the practiced invisibility of people paid extremely well to not be noticed, and not full enough, nowhere near full enough of anything resembling warmth. He had not argued with her resignation. He rarely argued with the truth, even when it was aimed at him. "There is a 12th candidate," Oh Sang-min said, from the doorway of the study, not knocking, because Sang-min had stopped knocking on doors in this house around the same year Seo-jun's father had died and left him the title of Director of Operations along with an authority that had, over 2 decades, calcified into something closer to co-ownership of every decision that moved through the building. He was 54, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well, dressed in the kind of understated tailoring that announced money to people who knew how to read it and announced nothing to people who didn't, and he had been the second most powerful man in Han Seo-jun's life since before Seo-jun had a life that could be described as powerful at all. "The agency sent the file this afternoon. I've had it reviewed." "Reviewed by whom?" "By people whose job it is to review such things." Sang-min set a slim folder on the desk, precisely aligned with its edge, the way he aligned everything, a man who found disorder personally offensive. Song Mira, 31. 6 years with the Yoon family in Cheongdam, excellent references, fluent in 3 languages including English, background clean at every level I checked, and I checked at levels the agency does not know I have access to. He said this without any particular emphasis, the way another man might mention the weather, and Seo-jun had long since stopped being unsettled by how casually Sang-min discussed the machinery of surveillance that ran underneath the group's legitimate business like plumbing under a house. Necessary, unglamorous, the kind of infrastructure you only thought about when it broke. "She starts Thursday. I'd suggest not attending the intake this time. Let Mrs. Beck handle it. You attending puts a pressure on the room that doesn't help the boy." Seo-jun did not look up from the window. "You've said that about the last 4. I've been right about the last 4. Sang-min's voice carried the particular patience of a man who had said something twice already and expected to be believed the 3rd time simply because he had said it twice. Grief responds to consistency, not to the presence of the person grieving hardest. You standing in the doorway watching every intake interview like a man watching a verdict does not create consistency. Creates theater. The boy can feel theater. Children always can. It was infuriatingly probably true, and Seo-jun let it sit without conceding it out loud, because conceding things out loud to Sang-min had become, over the years, a habit he tried to ration. "Thursday," he said instead. "Thursday." Sang-min paused at the door, the folder already forgotten on the desk behind him. A man whose mind had already moved 3 tasks down a list Seo-jun would never see the whole of. "There's a board session on the 14th. The Foundation's quarterly. I'll need 20 minutes of your actual attention this time. Not the version where you sign what I put in front of you. You always need 20 minutes of my actual attention. And you never quite give it to me," Sang-min said, in a tone that might have been humor on a different man, in a different decade, before the specific weight of running an empire that pretended not to be one had worn every soft edge off both of them. He left. The rain kept falling on the driveway, expensive and quiet, and Seo-jun looked at the folder on the desk without opening it, because he had learned, by the 11th time, exactly how much hope a folder was allowed to contain, and it was none. 6,000 miles west and 14 hours behind, in a row house on a narrow street in Baltimore where the sycamores had already gone half bare for the season, Maya Ellison sat at her mother's kitchen table with a termination letter in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other, reading the same paragraph for the 5th time as though rereading it might change what it said. Following review of the incident on September 3rd involving a patient in the Pediatric Trauma and Rehabilitation Wing, and in light of concerns raised regarding deviation from established clinical protocol, Chesapeake Children's Center for Pediatric Rehabilitation has made the decision to terminate Ms. Ellison's employment, effective immediately. Deviation from established clinical protocol. That was the phrase they'd landed on, After 2 internal reviews and 1 meeting with an HR representative who would not meet her eyes and a hospital attorney who had clearly been coached to say as little as possible in a room with a recording device visibly present on the table between them. Deviation from established clinical protocol meant this. An 8-year-old boy named Malcolm, 3 weeks post-surgical from a spinal procedure that had left him terrified of being touched by anyone in scrubs, had begun, on the afternoon of September 3rd, to spiral into the kind of panic that pediatric units were built to prevent and rarely knew what to do with when prevention failed, thrashing against restraints that existed for his own safety, screaming in a way that brought 2 nurses and an attending running, his oxygen numbers dropping in the particular way that made monitors scream their own alarm on top of his. Maya had been 3 doors down finishing a session with another patient. She had heard it. She had walked in, assessed in 4 seconds what 4 trained adults in the room had not been able to assess in 4 minutes, which was that the boy was not afraid of being restrained, he was afraid of silence, of the specific white noise silence of machines and clipped instructions that made his body remember an operating room he'd been sedated for and had no other way to process, and she had done the only thing she had ever known to reliably work with a child in that particular flavor of terror. She had sat on the floor beside the bed, out of arm's reach, and she had sung. Not a clinical intervention. Not on the approved list of de-escalation techniques the unit's protocol manual specified, which ran to 14 pages and included nothing resembling a grown woman's low, steady voice singing an old porch song her own mother used to hum, 6 notes that climbed and came back down like something breathing. Malcolm had stopped screaming within 90 seconds. His numbers had climbed back into range within 4 minutes. He had, according to the chart, slept for the first unbroken 3 hours since his surgery. And the hospital, 3 weeks later, facing a furious donor family whose grandson had, in their retelling, been handled inappropriately by unauthorized physical and vocal contact outside the treatment plan, had needed someone to have made a mistake because someone always needed to have made a mistake in situations like that, and Maya, 29, 5 years into a career she'd built 1 credential at a time, no institutional power, no family name on any wing of the building, had been the mistake it was cheapest to assign. She had not fought it the way she should have. She'd wanted to. Her attorney, a friend from her cousin's church who'd taken the case as a favor and clearly wished she hadn't, had told her plainly that fighting it would take 18 months and a level of savings Maya did not have, that the hospital's insurer would outlast her before it outlast itself, and that the practical math of her life, her mother 11 weeks out from a stroke that had taken the strength from her left side and half her ability to trust her own balance, the second mortgage on the row house that Maya had co-signed without telling her mother the actual interest rate, the specific exhaustion of being 29 and functionally the only adult keeping a household solvent, did not leave room for a fight that paid nothing for a year and a half while it was being fought. She had signed the severance agreement. She had let it go, in the specific way you let go of things that are still technically yours, still lodged somewhere under the ribs where you can feel their shape even after your hands have released them. "You're doing the math face again," her mother said from the doorway, moving with the cane the therapist had prescribed and mostly refused to use except when Maya was watching, because Gloria Ellison had spent 61 years being the strong one in every room she occupied and was not, for months into recovery, prepared to relinquish the performance of it even to her own daughter. "I'm not doing a math face. You've had that same cup of coffee in your hand for 40 minutes and it's stone cold and you haven't drunk a drop of it. That's a math face." Gloria lowered herself into the chair across the table with the careful economy of someone whose body had recently taught her new rules about how much it cost to move suddenly. "What's the number?" Maya turned the termination letter face down on the table, an old reflex, the same one she'd used as a teenager sliding report cards out of sight before her mother got home from her second shift. "It doesn't matter what the number is. It matters to me. Then it's not a number you need to carry, because I've already carried it and there's no version of you carrying it too that makes it lighter." She said it more sharply than she meant to, and regretted it instantly, watching something flicker across her mother's face. Not hurt exactly, Gloria didn't hurt easy, but a kind of weary recognition, the look of a woman who knew precisely what her daughter was doing and had done the identical thing herself for 30 years before the stroke made the doing of it physically impossible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I know what you meant." Gloria reached across the table with her good hand, the right one, and set it over Maya's wrist, not gripping, just present. "I raised you to be the one who fixes things quietly so nobody else has to carry the worry of it. I did that. That's my doing, and I've had 11 weeks flat on my back to think about whether it was a good thing I did, and I've come to the conclusion that it wasn't entirely. You're 29 years old, and you've been the load-bearing wall in this house since you were 16. That's not a compliment, baby. That's a confession. Maya didn't answer that because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't have made both of them cry at a kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon, and Gloria seemed to sense the same thing, because she let the silence hold for a moment before she reached for the folded newspaper insert she'd brought in with her, the kind of local circular that still ran in the free box outside the pharmacy, and slid it across the table. Priya from the church called this morning. Her cousin runs one of those agencies, the ones that place caregivers overseas, nannies, home health aides, that sort of thing, for wealthy families in Asia mostly. Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong. Priya said the money is real money, not this country money. Say what you want about it, but it's real money, and it comes with housing, and it's the kind of thing that could put a real dent in what that hospital left you holding. She tapped the circular. I'm not telling you to go halfway around the world, Maya. I'm telling you that you have a set of hands that knows how to calm down a frightened child better than any protocol manual that fired you for using them, and somebody somewhere is going to need exactly that, and they're going to pay for it instead of punishing you for it. Maya looked at the circular for a long moment. Outside, the sycamores shed another handful of leaves onto a street that had been her whole world for 29 years, and inside her chest something moved that she did not immediately have a name for. Not hope exactly. She'd gotten wary of hope somewhere around the second internal review, but something adjacent to it. A door that hadn't been there a minute ago, cracked open half an inch. I'd be gone a long time, she said finally. Not a trip. Placement. Months, maybe longer. I've got Denise next door, and Marcus checks on me twice a week already, and I am 61, not 90. Gloria's mouth curved, the good side of her face doing most of the work, the way it had since the stroke. A small crooked smile that Maya had learned to love precisely because of its asymmetry. And you'd call. You'd call so much I'd get tired of hearing your voice, which we both know isn't going to happen, but you'd try. Mom! I am not asking you to stay here and keep being the load-bearing wall, Maya Renee. I am asking you to go be exactly as good at your work as you have always been, somewhere that will pay you for it instead of firing you for it, and to let your mother finally get to be the one worrying about you crossing a street safely instead of the other way around for once. It would do my heart good. Gloria squeezed her wrist once, firm despite everything the stroke had taken. Call the number. The agency was called Halcyon Overseas Placements, run out of a modest office suite in a business park off the Beltway that did not match the scale of the fee schedule Maya found on their website, and the woman who conducted her intake call, a coordinator named Preeti who spoke with the crisp, efficient warmth of someone who had done 400 of these calls and genuinely still cared about the 401st, walked her through the process with a speed that left Maya slightly breathless. Background check, credential verification, 3 video interviews with prospective families over the following 6 weeks, and then, abruptly, faster than Maya had expected any of it to move, an offer. Except it was the wrong offer. Or rather, and this was a detail Maya would only fully understand much later, turning it over with the particular clarity that hindsight provides free of charge. It was the right offer attached to the wrong intake file, because Halcyon's back office that month was processing 41 placements through a system that had been quietly failing to sync properly with its own database for the better part of a year, a fact that would eventually surface in an internal audit nobody outside the company would ever hear about, and in the specific chaos of that particular Tuesday, a coordinator named Farah, 6 months into the job and covering for a colleague on leave, had pulled the wrong printed intake packet from the wrong stack of manila folders on her desk when she prepared the outbound documents for a placement in Seoul. Maya had interviewed over video call with a household in Cheongdam, the Yoon family, a young couple with 2 children and a straightforward need for after-school supervision, nothing complicated, nothing that had made her pulse do anything unusual. She had liked them. She had said yes when the offer came through 3 days later, had signed what she believed to be the Yoon family's placement agreement, had packed a suitcase and said the version of goodbye to her mother that both of them had privately agreed not to make into a bigger occasion than it needed to be, because bigger occasions had a way of turning into things you couldn't come back from without acknowledging how large they'd been. She did not know. Boarding a 14-hour flight to Incheon with a paperback she wouldn't open and a photograph of her mother tucked into her passport case, that the address printed on her final placement documents was not Cheongdam. She did not know that the household staff waiting for her arrival had been told to expect a woman named Song Miare, 31, 6 years experience with the Yoon family. A different Yoon family entirely. A coincidence of surname that would later strike everyone involved as almost too absurd to be believed, except that Korea has roughly the same handful of common family names doing an enormous amount of quiet, unglamorous work behind the scenes of every large-scale clerical error. The way certain streets in certain cities keep producing the same kind of accident year after year simply because of how the roads were laid out to begin with. She did not know that the real song Mare at that moment was 3 days into a different placement entirely, in a house in Cheongdam belonging to a young couple who had been expecting a woman named Maya Ellison and had, after 2 increasingly confused phone calls to Halcyon's Baltimore office, simply accepted the substitution because Ms. Song's references were, by every measure they could verify, spectacular, and their need was immediate, and neither family, in the end, complained loudly. Enough for anyone at Halcyon to trace the error back to its source before it had already, quietly, changed the shape of several lives. She landed at Incheon at 6:40 in the morning, local time, jet-lagged and wrung out and carrying a folder of paperwork she had not thought to reread on the plane, and a driver was waiting at arrivals holding a small printed sign with a name on it that was not hers, and because she was tired, and because the sign said Halcyon placement in smaller letters underneath the name, and because it did not occur to her, why would it, that an agency might send a driver to collect the wrong woman under someone else's name, she walked toward the sign anyway, and the driver, a young man who did not speak much English and had been told only to collect the Halcyon placement and deliver her to the Yeonhwi-dong address, did not ask her name at all. He simply took her suitcase, opened the car door, and drove her through the gray, waking outskirts of Seoul toward a house that was not, and had never been, expecting Maya Ellison. The gate on Yeonhwi-dong's quietest street was 12 feet of black iron set into a stone wall that had been built, according to the small brass plate beside the intercom, in 1987, and reinforced twice since, in ways the plate did not mention. Maya stood at it with her suitcase and a folder of paperwork she was only now, belatedly, actually reading through, jet lag finally burning off enough for her eyes to focus properly on the print, and felt the first small cold thread of wrongness slide down the back of her neck when she reached the 3rd page and saw a name typed at the top of the intake summary that was not her own. Candidate: Song Mi-ra, age 31. Prior placement: Yoon residence, Cheongdam-dong, 6 years. She stood at the gate rereading it twice, the way you reread a word that suddenly looks unfamiliar the longer you look at it, and felt the specific vertigo of realizing that a piece of paper meant to describe you described someone else entirely, in a country 14 hours and 1 language barrier away from anyone who could immediately fix it for her. The intercom crackled before she'd decided what to do about it. Halcyon placement? A woman's voice, brisk, accented, clearly having said this exact phrase to 11 previous women over 14 months and audibly bracing for whatever the 12th would turn out to be. Maya looked at the gate. She looked at the folder in her hand, at a name that wasn't hers sitting above a biography that also wasn't hers, at a driver already pulling away behind her because his job had ended at the curb, at 6:52 in the morning in a city where she knew perhaps 9 words of the language and had, as far as she could currently determine, no functioning phone number for the actual family she'd interviewed with 3 weeks ago in Baltimore. Yes, she said, because there was, in that particular moment, standing alone at a gate in a country she'd landed in 4 hours ago, no version of the truth complicated enough to explain and no other useful word available to say. Yes, I'm the Halcyon placement. The gate opened. Mrs. Beck met her in the entrance hall. A woman in her 50s with the particular exhausted efficiency of someone who had onboarded 11 strangers into this house and had stopped expecting any of them to be the answer to a problem she'd long since concluded had no answer, and walked her through an intake so fast, so clearly designed to get a warm body into a role before anyone changed their mind, that Maya's quiet, escalating alarm about the wrong name on the paperwork had no natural opening to surface in. There was a stack of forms. There was a pen. There was Mrs. Beck's finger indicating a line at the bottom of the household's internal security log. A separate document from Halcyon's paperwork, a formality, standard for anyone entering the property. Mrs. Beck explained in rapid, efficient English, name and date and signature, purely procedural, and Maya, exhausted, disoriented, holding a folder that told her she was someone else and a pen that Mrs. Beck had already pressed into her hand, looked at the line that said name, print, and in the specific fog of 14 hours of travel and a wrongness she hadn't yet found the words to raise, wrote the only name that felt true in that moment, which was her own. Maya Ellison. Mrs. Beck did not look at it closely. She had learned, over 11 intakes, that closely inspecting the paperwork of women, who mostly did not last the month, was an expenditure of attention she had stopped budgeting for. She took the form, filed it in the household binder without a second glance, and led Maya up a staircase wide enough to drive a small car up, into a house so quiet it felt less like silence and more like something actively being withheld. "The boy's name is Ji-ho," Mrs. Beck said, at the top of the stairs, her voice dropping into something more careful. "He does not speak. He has not spoken in 14 months. I tell you this now so you are not surprised, and so you understand it is not something you did or will do. It is simply how it is." She paused outside a door at the end of a long hallway, her hand on the frame, and for just a moment something moved across her professionally composed face that looked almost like an apology directed at the child on the other side of the door rather than at Maya. "The others did not last. I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because I think you should know what you are walking into before you walk into it." She opened the door. The room beyond it was large and pale and extraordinarily tidy in the specific way that rooms belonging to children who did not make messes were tidy. No scattered toys, no chaos of half-finished projects, just a bed made with hospital precision and a shelf of books arranged by height and a desk where a boy sat with a sketchbook open in front of him, drawing, with total absorption, the same shape he had drawn several hundred times in the 14 months since his mother's car had gone off a wet coastal road outside a town called Saksho. A car, headlights, and behind it, always, a second pair of headlights that no specialist had yet convinced him to explain. He did not look up when the door opened. Maya had worked with enough traumatized children to recognize immediately what she was looking at, the specific stillness of a nervous system that had decided, somewhere below the level of conscious choice, that the safest possible action in any new situation was no action at all, and something in her chest, the same something that had made her sit on a hospital floor and sing to a screaming 8-year-old 3 weeks before the world decided that instinct was a fireable offense, settled, quietly, into the particular focus she recognized as the only part of herself the termination letter hadn't touched. "Hi, Ji-ho," she said, staying in the doorway, not moving toward him, because the first rule, the rule underneath all the other rules, was that you let the frightened ones set the distance. "I'm Maya. I'm going to be around for a while if that's okay with you. You don't have to say anything back. I just wanted you to know my name." He kept drawing, but his pencil, for just a moment, went still over the paper. Not stopped, not put down, just held, suspended a half-inch above the second pair of headlights he'd been about to add, and then it resumed, and Mrs. Beck, watching from the hallway with the particular weary hope of a woman who had learned not to trust small signs and was, despite herself, cataloging this one anyway, said nothing at all. Han Seo-jun did not meet the 12th nanny until dinner 3 days later, and only because Mrs. Beck had specifically requested it, in the careful, deferential phrasing she used for the rare occasions she disagreed with Sangmin's instructions, saying only that this one seemed different in a way she could not fully articulate in a report, and that she thought the chairman should see it himself before deciding anything. He found Maya in the small dining room off the kitchen where Ji-ho took his meals, not the formal dining room that seated 20 and had hosted precisely one dinner party since Sua's death, and stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself, the old habit, watching before being watched, and saw his son sitting at a low table with a woman he had never met, a plate of food between them, and the woman was not talking at him the way the others had talked at him. A steady, anxious stream of prompts and questions designed to fill a silence that made adults uncomfortable. She was simply eating her own dinner, quietly, at his son's pace, matching a stillness Ji-ho had spent 14 months building like a wall around himself, instead of trying to talk her way through it. "Mr. Han." She noticed him first, setting down her chopsticks with the unhurried economy of someone who had decided a long time ago that startling was a performance she wasn't interested in giving. She did not stand, which surprised him. Every other member of staff in this house rose the instant he entered a room, a reflex trained so deep it had become involuntary, and he understood, watching her stay seated beside his son with the same unbothered calm she'd apparently brought to the whole meal, that she had made a specific, deliberate choice not to disrupt whatever equilibrium she and Ji-ho had built across 3 days and however many silent dinners, even for the man who owned the house they were sitting in. "Miss Song," he said, using the name on the file Sangmin had given him, and watched something flicker across her face. Quick, controlled, gone before he could fully name it, that he filed away without understanding yet what he was filing. Maya, she said. Maya Ellison. There was. She glanced, very briefly, at Ji-ho, and adjusted whatever she'd been about to say into something smaller. There's been a mix-up with the paperwork, actually. I've been meaning to raise it with Mrs. Beck. I'm not the candidate you were expecting. Something in Seo-jun's chest went very still, the old reflex, the one honed across 2 decades of men and women who came into rooms with him carrying information he had not yet been given, and the room's temperature seemed to drop 3 degrees before he'd said a single word in response. Explain. I signed my own name on an intake form that had someone else's name printed on it, she said, with the particular flat honesty of a woman who had clearly decided, sometime in the last 3 days, that the fastest way through an awkward truth was directly, rather than around. The paperwork I received from my agency said I'd be working for a family in Cheongdam. I don't know how I ended up here instead, but I signed in under my own name because it was the only name I had, and nobody looked closely enough to catch it before now, apparently, and I've been sitting on that discomfort for 3 days trying to figure out the correct way to bring it up that didn't sound like I was confessing to something. Ji-ho, beside her, had gone very still, watching his father with the particular wariness he brought to every unscheduled variable in his day, and Seo-jun made himself unclench a jaw he hadn't noticed tightening, because his son's stillness had taught him, across 14 months, to modulate his own before it could be read as a threat. You could have left, he said. Once you realized the error. I could have. She held his gaze without flinching, and he noted that too, filed it alongside the other things he was filing without yet knowing what shape the file would take. But your son ate an entire dinner sitting next to me 3 nights running without anyone pushing him to perform being okay. And I've spent 5 years of my professional life learning exactly what that kind of quiet is worth to a child who's been asked to perform being okay for people 100 times an hour since something broke him. I wasn't going to walk out over a clerical error and leave that on the table because the paperwork had someone else's name on it. She paused. I'll understand if that's a problem for you. Probably should be. I'm telling you the truth about it because I'd rather you hear it from me than find it in a file later and wonder what else I didn't mention. Seo-jun looked at his son. Ji-ho was looking back at him and then, in a motion so small Seo-jun almost missed it entirely, looked sideways at Maya, and then back at his food, and picked his chopsticks back up and resumed eating at his own unhurried pace, beside a woman whose name was not the one on any of the household's official documents. Have Mrs. Beck correct the file, Seo-jun said finally, and if there was something underneath the flatness of the instruction that sounded, to his own ear, disconcertingly like relief, he did not examine it closely enough to name it. Under your actual name. Thank you, Maya said, and did not smile exactly, but something in her face eased half a degree, and Seo-jun turned and left the small dining room before he could notice anything else about the way his son's shoulders had lowered by the same half degree, sitting beside a stranger who had told him the truth instead of managing him, in a house that had run out, 14 months ago, of anyone who did either. The nightmare came on the 5th night, a little after 2 in the morning, and Maya heard it before she was fully awake. A thin, wordless sound through the wall between her room and Ji-ho's, not a scream. Ji-ho did not scream. The specialists had noted that too, in the file she'd been given to review, that his nightmares expressed themselves as motion and breath rather than sound, as though even in sleep some part of him had decided that noise was a risk he could not afford to take. She was in the hallway in under a minute and found him sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes open, unseeing, breath coming in the fast, shallow pulls of a body that believed, on some level below conscious thought, that it was still in a car on a wet road outside Sokcho. She did not turn on the overhead light. She had learned, in 5 years of work with children whose nervous systems had been rewired by things too large for their bodies to process safely, that sudden brightness in a moment like this could read as a second assault rather than a rescue. She sat on the floor beside his bed at a careful distance, the same distance she'd kept in the doorway on the first day, and did not touch him, and did not say his name loudly, and did the only thing she had ever known reliably worked, which was not clinical, was not on any protocol manual's approved list, was the exact thing a hospital in Baltimore had fired her for doing 3 months earlier. She sang. It was an old song, one she'd known before she knew what a song was. The kind of melody that had come into her family the way certain recipes come into a family, without anyone remembering exactly which grandmother had first hummed it over a stove or a crib, passed down through her mother's low, steady voice on porches and in kitchens, and once, memorably, in the front seat of a car during a thunderstorm when Maya was 7 and terrified, and her mother had simply started singing instead of telling her not to be scared, because telling a frightened child not to be scared had never once worked, and her mother had known that long before any protocol manual existed to say so. 6 notes, climbing, coming back down, climbing again, low and unhurried, the kind of melody built for exactly this. A body in the grip of something too large for words, needing not comfort exactly, not yet, but rhythm, the animal certainty that another creature nearby was breathing slow and steady and was not, itself, afraid. Jiho's breathing changed on the 3rd repetition. It did not stop being fast, but it found the rhythm of her voice the way a small boat finds the wake of a larger one, and by the 6th or 7th pass through the melody his eyes had come back into focus, had found her sitting on the floor at the careful distance she'd maintained since the first day, and something in his face. She would try, later, many times, to describe this moment to people who had not been in the room, and would never quite manage it, because there was no accurate way to convey what it looked like. For a child who had been gone for 14 months to arrive somewhere all at once. Something in his face came back online, present here, looking directly at her with the specific dark-eyed clarity of a boy who recognized, on some level too deep for language to reach yet, a sound that belonged to a part of his life from before the wall went up. He reached out, slowly, tentatively, the way you reach towards something you're not sure is real, and closed his small hand around the sleeve of Maya's shirt, and held on. She kept singing. She did not stop, did not speak, did not do anything to disturb the fragile, unprecedented thing happening in the dark of a room in a house that had absorbed and failed 11 previous attempts at exactly this. She sang the 6 notes, climbing and falling until his breathing slowed all the way down, and his hand, still fisted in the fabric of her sleeve, went loose with the specific looseness of a child finally, actually asleep, and she sat there on the floor for another 20 minutes after that. His hand still resting against her wrist even in sleep, and did not move, because some things you did not disturb once you had been lucky enough to receive them. She did not know, sitting there in the dark with a sleeping child's hand around her wrist, that the melody she just sung, passed down through her mother's voice, through some grandmother's voice before that, all the way back to a source none of them could name, had been sung in this exact house before, 6 years earlier, in a nursery that had since been converted into a study, by a young mother rocking her infant son to sleep with a song she'd carried home from 2 years of a life she'd never fully explained to anyone in this country. A song she called, when anyone asked, simply an old tune she'd picked up in Baltimore, from a woman who used to sing it while she cooked. She did not know it yet, but somewhere down the hall, in a study that had been a nursery, a framed photograph of a woman named Han Sua sat on a shelf, smiling at a version of the world that had not yet ended. And if the walls of that house could have spoken, they would have said that the 6 notes drifting down the hallway that night were not new to them at all. Word of the incident traveled through the house before breakfast, the way anything unusual traveled through a household staffed by people trained to notice everything and comment on nothing, which meant that by the time Maya came downstairs the next morning, still faintly disoriented from 4 hours of sleep, she found Mrs. Beck waiting for her in the kitchen with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral, and was failing at it in small, human ways around the eyes. "He held your sleeve," Mrs. Beck said, without preamble, setting a cup of coffee in front of Maya with more force than the gesture strictly required. "The night nurse, we keep someone on the monitor for him, a precaution since the accident." She saw it on the baby monitor feed. "He has not initiated physical contact with anyone in this house in 14 months. Not with me. Not with his own father. Not since the hospital, not since." She stopped herself, recalibrating, the careful edit of a woman who had decided a long time ago which parts of the story were hers to tell and which weren't. "It is significant," she said instead, more quietly. "I wanted you to know that I understand it is significant, even if I do not yet understand what you did." "I sang," Maya said. "That's all. It's not complicated. 11 women before you tried a great many complicated things," Mrs. Beck said, and there was something almost wry in it, the first thing resembling humor Maya had heard from her in 5 days. Perhaps complicated was never what he needed. Jiho himself, when he came down 20 minutes later, gave no outward sign that anything between them had shifted. He ate his breakfast in the same careful silence as every previous morning, did not look at Maya any longer or shorter than he had the day before, made no gesture toward the sleeve she'd worn the night before and had, admittedly, not laundered yet, some superstitious part of her unwilling to disturb evidence of the only good thing that had happened to her in 3 months. But when she stood to clear his plate, he did something he had not done on any of the previous 5 mornings. He pushed his chair back a few inches, angling it very slightly toward hers, a change so small that anyone not actively watching for it would have missed it entirely, and Maya, who had spent 5 years of her professional life learning to read exactly this kind of small print communication in children who had run out of any other alphabet, understood it for what it was. Not an invitation to conversation. Not yet. But a request that she stay in the room a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she did. The paperwork discrepancy surfaced properly 4 days later, in the specific way that things surfaced in a house run by a man like Oh Sang-min, which was quietly, without warning, and with the full weight of an apparatus that had been built over 2 decades to notice exactly this kind of irregularity before it could become a liability. Maya was summoned to the small office off the main hall that Sang-min used when he was in the house rather than at the Baekdu Group Tower in Gangnam, a room she had passed a dozen times without ever being invited into, and she understood, walking in, that the summons itself was a form of communication. Sang-min did not stand when she entered. He sat behind a desk with a single folder open in front of him, and did not invite her to sit, and let the silence stretch for a moment longer than was comfortable, a technique she recognized immediately for what it was, because she had spent 5 years watching hospital administrators use silence the same way, as a pressure applied before a single accusation had been spoken aloud. "Song Mra," he said finally, tapping the folder without looking up from it, "has been in a placement in Cheongdam for 11 days. I received a call this morning from that household security firm, following up on a discrepancy in their own intake paperwork, which led them, eventually, to a conversation with your former agency, which led, eventually, to me." He looked up. His eyes were the particular pale, assessing brown of a man who had built his entire career on noticing the one detail in a room that did not belong. "You are not Song Mra." "No," Maya said. "I told Mr. Han that myself 5 days ago. I assumed it had already been corrected. It has been corrected in the household staffing file. It had not, until this morning, been corrected in the security intake log, which is a separate system which I maintain personally, and which exists specifically to ensure that the person inside this house at any given hour is the person we have verified to be inside this house. Do you understand the difference? I understand you're telling me there's a system I fell through the cracks of. I am telling you," Sang-min said, and his voice did not rise, did not need to, "that for 5 days, a woman whose background check does not exist in my files has had unsupervised access to a 6-year-old child in a household that has, across its history, accumulated a specific and considerable number of enemies. I am telling you that the fact you happen to have told the chairman yourself does not change the fact that the correct protocol, upon realizing an error of this magnitude, was to inform security immediately, not to wait 5 days and resolve it through a dinner-table confession to a grieving father who was, at that moment, in no state to properly evaluate the risk you were describing to him." He closed the folder. "I have run your actual background now. Chesapeake Children's Center for Pediatric Rehabilitation. Terminated in September. The termination letter cites deviation from clinical protocol." He let that sentence sit in the air a moment, and Maya felt something in her stomach go cold, watching him build, with visible precision, an argument she recognized because she had already lived through a version of it once. "I am not in the business of assuming the worst about people, Ms. Ellison. I am in the business of assuming the worst about situations, which is a different discipline, and requires me to ask whether a woman recently terminated for deviating from protocol at one institution, currently occupying a household under a name that was not her own for 5 days without correction, represents a pattern I should be concerned about." "I understand why it looks that way," Maya said, and made herself keep her voice level, because she had learned, in the hospital's conference room 3 months ago, exactly what it cost her to let anger show in front of people who had already decided what conclusion they were reaching. "I'd ask you to also look at what actually happened in both cases. A child in acute panic responded to an intervention that wasn't in a manual. That's the whole of what got me fired. And a boy who hasn't spoken in 14 months held onto my sleeve for the first time in longer than anyone in this house can apparently remember, for days after I arrived under a name that was a clerical error at an agency. not a lie I told. I'm not asking you to trust me because I say so. I'm asking you to look at the actual outcome in the room, instead of the shape of the paperwork around it. Sangmin studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, Maya would think later, was not quite what she'd expected. Not simple suspicion, not the flat hostility of a man who had already decided to remove her, but something more like a private, careful recalibration, a man weighing a variable he had not accounted for and did not yet know what to do with. The boy held your sleeve, he said finally. For 4 minutes, according to the night nurse's log. I am aware of the outcome, Ms. Ellison. I am also aware that 4 minutes of physical contact, however meaningful, does not constitute a security clearance, and that my job in this house is not to be moved by outcomes. It is to prevent the outcomes that would end this family entirely. He opened a drawer, withdrew a fresh set of forms, and slid them across the desk. You will complete these, properly this time under your correct name, and I will expedite the background verification myself so this does not happen again. You may go. She went and did not fully exhale until she was 3 doors down the hallway, and did not yet understand, would not understand for weeks, that the man she had just been quietly, precisely interrogated by had spent the previous 2 decades building exactly the kind of apparatus capable of erasing a paper trail as easily as constructing one, and that his sudden, personal interest in expediting her background check was not, entirely, the simple diligence it appeared to be. Han Seo-jun heard about the interrogation from Sangmin himself, delivered as a brief, procedural update over the secure line late that afternoon, the kind of report Sangmin gave a dozen times a week about matters far more consequential than a nanny's paperwork, and something in the flatness of the delivery, a background irregularity now resolved, no further concern, did not sit right in a way Seo-jun couldn't immediately name. You interrogated her, he said. I clarified a discrepancy, Sangmin said. There's a difference. Is there? Seo-jun. Sangmin's voice carried the particular patience he used when he believed he was managing an emotional man through a rational process, a tone Seo-jun had heard directed at him 100 times over 2 decades and had, until recently, mostly accepted as earned. I have watched 11 women walk through that gate and fail your son in 11 different ways. I am not going to apologize for verifying the 12th one properly before I let myself hope she might be the exception. You would do the same in my position. You have done the same, in every negotiation you have ever conducted, verified the paper before you trusted the man holding it. He held her sleeve, Seo-jun said, and heard, even as he said it, how much smaller and more exposed it sounded out loud than it had felt sitting alone with the night nurse's report an hour earlier. 14 months, Sangmin. You interrogated the first thing that's worked in 14 months, over paperwork. A pause on the line, longer than Sangmin's pauses usually ran. I did what the job requires, he said finally. I would remind you that the job exists because someone has to do the things that feeling does not permit you to do clearly. You are welcome to resent me for it. You have resented me for smaller things and been wrong to. Seo-jun did not answer that, and Sangmin, after a moment, ended the call with the same clipped efficiency he brought to everything, and Seo-jun sat alone in his study with the day's remaining light going gray in the window and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily place, questioning not the substance of what Sangmin had done. The man was not wrong that the house needed exactly the kind of vigilance he provided, but the specific absolute confidence with which he'd done it, the total absence, in 20 years, of a single moment where Sangmin's judgment had ever visibly wavered. He filed the thought away without examining it further, the way he filed most things that didn't yet have a shape he could act on, and did not yet know that he would return to it weeks later with an entirely different understanding of what it meant that Sangmin had never once, in 2 decades, been wrong about anything in a way that anyone else had been permitted to discover. Yu Se-yun arrived for dinner on a Friday, 11 days into Maya's placement, in a black car that matched the house's own fleet closely enough that Maya, glancing out the nursery window, mistook it for one of Sangmin's for a full 10 seconds before the woman who stepped out of it resolved into someone she'd never seen. She was beautiful in the specific, engineered way of women raised inside a very particular tier of Seoul's business elite. Every visible detail curated toward an impression of effortlessness that had clearly taken considerable effort to construct, and she moved through the entrance hall with the easy proprietary confidence of someone who had been in this house before and expected, eventually, to belong to it more completely. Maya learned her name and her purpose within an hour, from Mrs. Beck, delivered in the low, careful voice the housekeeper used for information she considered above her station to comment on but felt obligated to provide anyway. Her father runs U Corporation. Textiles, shipping interests that overlap with the Baekdu groups in 3 ports. The board has been suggesting the match since 8 months after the accident. Mrs. Beck's mouth had tightened almost imperceptibly on the word suggesting. Suggesting is a generous word for what Director O has actually been doing about it. There have been 4 dinners in the last 6 months. This will be the 5th. Maya had not been meant to witness any part of the dinner itself. Her role, per the household's usual arrangement, ended at Jiho's bedtime, which fell a full hour before formal guests were ever seated. But she was in the hallway outside the small family sitting room when Se-yun, arriving early, encountered Jiho on his way up to bed, and what happened in the 90 seconds that followed told Maya more about the woman than a month of second-hand description could have. "Oh," Se-yun said, looking down at the boy with an expression that was not cruel exactly, not in the theatrical way Maya might have expected from the setup Mrs. Beck's warning had implied, but something colder and somehow worse for its lack of drama. A kind of practiced, efficient dismissal, the specific blankness of a woman who had simply never developed a category in her mind for children who weren't yet useful to a conversation. "You're still up." She did not crouch to his eye level. She did not ask his name, though she certainly knew it. She looked at him the way she might have looked at an unexpected piece of furniture blocking a hallway, a minor obstacle to be noted and moved past, and said, to no one in particular, in the general direction of the household staff assembling nearby, "Someone should really have a better system for this," before continuing into the sitting room without waiting to see whether anyone responded. Jiho did not react visibly. He had learned, Maya understood watching his face carefully in the low hallway light, exactly how to absorb a dismissal like that without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. A skill no 6-year-old should have needed to develop, and something in Maya's chest went hot and tight in a way she recognized from 100 hospital hallways, watching adults fail children in the specific, bloodless way that never quite rose to the level anyone official would act on. She crouched down to his level instead, in the hallway, in full view of anyone who cared to notice, and did not say anything about the woman who just walked past him, because children did not need adults narrating the unfairness of the world at them in real time. They needed the world, immediately following an unfairness, to contain at least one person who treated them like they mattered. "Bedtime," she said. "I'll read the one about the boat again if you want." He nodded. It was the 4th time in 11 days that he had answered a direct, low-stakes question of hers with a nod instead of nothing at all, and she had started, privately, keeping a kind of ledger of these small answers, not because she needed proof of progress for anyone else's benefit, but because she had learned, the hard way, that the only real evidence of the work she did lived in details this small, and she did not intend to let anyone talk her out of trusting what she was actually watching happen in front of her. She found Han Seo-jun in the garden 2 nights later than she'd expected anyone in the house to be awake, standing at the edge of a small koi pond that had clearly been designed by someone with considerably more money than aesthetic restraint. His jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking at the water with the specific stillness of a man who had come outside to think about something and had not yet decided whether he wanted to be interrupted. "I can go back inside," Maya said, from the garden path, having come out only because Jiho, restless after the dinner 2 nights prior, had needed a longer walk through his bedtime routine than usual, and she'd stepped out for 2 minutes of air while he settled. "You don't have to." He didn't turn immediately. "Sang-min told you about the security file." He clarified a discrepancy, Maya said, echoing the phrase without meaning to, and something in Seo-jun's mouth moved, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement of the specific dryness she'd used it with. "That's his phrase. I've heard it a great many times over the years, usually applied to things considerably more complicated than a paperwork error." He looked at her now, properly, the first time she'd felt him actually studying her rather than assessing her as a variable in his son's care. "I owe you an apology for it. It shouldn't have happened the way it happened. He is very good at his job. He is not always kind about how he does it. I don't need an apology. I understand why the house is careful." She came to stand a few feet from him, at the edge of the pond, watching the koi move in slow, orange shapes beneath the black water. "I would have wanted the same thing verified in his position. I just wish it had happened before your son heard about it instead of after. He noticed something was wrong in the house today. Kids always do. Seojun was quiet for a moment. He held your sleeve, he said finally, in a voice that had lost some of the careful flatness she'd heard from him at every previous encounter. The night nurse's report. I've read it 11 times since Sangmin told me about it, which is a strange thing to admit to a woman I've known for 11 days, but I don't know what else to do with a piece of information that large except keep rereading it. It surprised me too, Maya admitted. I've worked with a lot of kids who've been through something they don't have language for yet. There's not usually a moment that clean. Usually it's smaller, slower, you don't get to point to the exact night it started. Why do you think it worked? The singing. He asked it plainly, without the guardedness she might have expected from a man who'd spent an entire dinner conversation. 5 days into her placement, mostly not looking directly at her. The other women tried talking to him. Games, therapy exercises, a specialist who came recommended by a hospital in Zurich. None of it moved him an inch. Maya considered the question seriously because it deserved to be considered seriously. I think talking asks something of him, she said. It asks him to organize what happened into words, and I don't think he has words for it yet, maybe won't for a long time, maybe some part of it he'll never have words for, and every time an adult sits down and asks him a question, even a gentle one, some part of him hears a demand under it. Perform. Respond. Prove you're getting better. She looked out at the water. Singing doesn't ask anything. It's just a sound that says someone's here, and they're not scared, and you don't have to do anything at all except keep breathing next to it. I think that's the only thing his body's been willing to receive since the accident. Everything else has a cost attached, even when nobody means for it to. Seojun didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had gone somewhere quieter. Somewhere she suspected he did not often let it go in front of people who worked in his house. His mother used to sing to him, he said. Not that song. A different one, in Korean, something from a children's program she liked. I used to hear it through the nursery door and think it was the most ordinary sound in the world, and I didn't understand, until it stopped, how much of the house's actual architecture depended on ordinary sounds like that continuing. He looked at the water. I don't know how to give him that back. I've tried recreating the song. Mrs. Beck found the program online, we've played it for him a dozen times. It doesn't do anything. It's not that it's the wrong song. I think it's that the song was never really the thing that mattered. It was that she was singing it, specifically, and he could feel her being calm while she did. And no recording of anything can replicate a person's hands being steady while they hold you. Maya looked at him for a long moment, something in his face open in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. The careful executive stillness dropped for just long enough to let something more human through, and she thought, unexpectedly, that this was probably the loneliest house she'd ever set foot in, for all its size, for all the staff moving quietly through its rooms at every hour, because the two people who lived at its center had spent 14 months unable to give each other the one thing either of them actually needed, which was simply another person, steady, present, not performing anything, not asking anything, just there. I should get back in, she said finally, softly. He'll want the light on for another few minutes before he's actually asleep. Maya. He said her name for the first time since the dinner where she'd corrected it, and something in the way he said it, plainly, without the careful distance of Miss Ellison or the earlier error of Miss Song, made her stop on the garden path and look back at him. Thank you, he said, for the sleeve, for staying in the house after Sangmin's questions instead of deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. I don't say that easily, and I mean it exactly as much as it sounds like I do. You're welcome, she said, and went back inside, and did not look back to see him remain at the edge of the pond for another 20 minutes after she'd gone, watching the koi move beneath water that reflected nothing back at him except a sky with no moon in it that night, thinking about a woman's steady hands and a song that had never really been about the song at all. She called her mother on a Sunday, the house quiet around her. Jiho settled for the afternoon with a jigsaw puzzle he'd taken to assembling and disassembling with a patience that Mrs. Beck said had not existed before Maya's arrival, and Gloria's voice came through the line with the particular warmth that made 12 time zones feel, for a few minutes, like the length of a hallway rather than an ocean. You sound tired, Gloria said, by way of greeting, because she had never in Maya's life opened a phone call with hello when there was a more useful observation available first. I'm okay. It's a lot, but it's the good kind of a lot. Maya sat on the edge of her bed, looking out at the garden below, at the koi pond where she'd stood 2 nights earlier. The little boy I'm working with. I think something's actually happening, Mom. I think it's working. Well, of course it's working. You've been doing this since you were 16 years old, and Deacon Price's grandbaby wouldn't stop screaming through the whole service until you took him in the back and hummed him down in about 90 seconds flat. I could have told that hospital exactly what they were losing when they let you go. If anybody there had thought to ask a 59-year-old church lady in Baltimore what she thought about their clinical protocols. Gloria's laugh crackled faintly through the line, warm and a little worn. The sound of a woman 4 months into recovery who still found the energy for it anyway. What song did you use? On the little boy. Ours. Grandma's, I guess, or wherever it actually came from. The one you used to sing in the car. There was a pause on the line, brief, that Maya didn't think anything of at the time. That old thing, Gloria said, and something in her voice had gone a little distant, a little turned toward some memory Maya couldn't see the shape of. You know, I used to sing that to a girl who boarded with us years back. Before you'd remember much of it, you were, 12, 13. Sarah, her name was. Sweet thing, quiet, always looked like she was carrying something heavier than she let on. She was here on some kind of program a couple years, studying something to do with money and nonprofits. I never did get the details straight. Terrible homesick, that girl. Used to sit at my kitchen table some nights just needing to hear somebody's voice be calm at her. And I'd sing that same old thing, and she'd settle right down, same as your little boy does, I'd bet. Gloria's voice warmed further, sliding into the specific fondness reserved for old, half-forgotten stories. She went back home eventually. Got married, I think, sent us a Christmas card or two with a photograph, some big-to-do wedding, looked like something out of a magazine, and then, well, life moves. The cards stopped coming after a few years. I think about her sometimes. Wonder if she's doing all right, wherever she ended up. Do you remember her last name? Maya asked, and could not, in the moment, have said exactly why the question mattered, only that something in her chest had gone quiet and alert in a way she recognized from 100 moments of noticing a detail in a chart that didn't line up with the others around it. Lord, no, baby, it's been better than 15 years. Some Korean name, I never did learn to say it right, and she went by Sarah the whole time she was here anyway. Said it was easier for everybody. A pause. Why do you ask? No reason, Maya said, and did not, in that moment, have a reason that made any coherent sense to offer. Only a small cold thread of something she couldn't name yet, coiled at the base of her spine, and she let the conversation move on to other things. Denise next door, Marcus's promotion, the specific indignities of physical therapy, and did not think about it again for 11 more days, until the afternoon Han Seo-jun asked her to help him go through a box of his late wife's things that he had not been able to open alone. Oh Sang-min watched the black car carrying Yoo Se-yeon pull away from the gate on Yonghwi-dong's quietest street from the window of his own study 3 floors above the garden, and did not feel the particular satisfaction the sight would once have given him, because the dinner had gone, by any objective measure, badly, Seo-jun distracted throughout, his attention visibly elsewhere, and Se-yeon herself, sharper than her father gave her credit for, had noticed it, had said as much on her way out. With the flat, unbothered practicality of a woman who did not intend to compete for a man's attention against a household employee, however briefly. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that did not appear in any directory associated with the Baekta Group, legitimate or otherwise, and waited 3 rings before a voice answered. The American, he said without preamble. I want everything. Not the agency file. Everything. Where she's from, who she's spoken to, what she's told her mother on the phone. Whether she has kept records of anything she's observed in that house. He watched the koi pond below, dark and still under a sky with no moon in it. I have spent 20 years ensuring that nothing enters this house that I have not personally verified down to the studs. I am not going to let a clerical error at an overseas placement agency be the exception, particularly not now. Pause, listening. I don't care what it costs. Report to me directly, not through the household system. He ended the call and stood at the window a moment longer, watching the water, thinking about a foundation's quarterly numbers that needed, once again, a particular kind of careful attention before the board session on the 14th, and about a woman named Han Sua who had once, 6 years ago, asked him a question about those same numbers that he had never quite forgiven her for asking, and had told himself, for 6 years, that he had already dealt with completely. The word came on a Tuesday, in the kind of ordinary afternoon light that made it seem, afterward, almost unfair that something so large had chosen so small a moment to happen in. Maya and Ji-ho were in the garden, the koi pond glinting under a sky finally clear of the month's rain, and Ji-ho had brought his sketchbook outside for the first time since Maya's arrival, not to draw the car. She had noticed, cataloging it in the private ledger she kept of his small changes, that he had not drawn the car in 9 days, the longest gap in the pattern since the accident. But to draw the koi themselves, orange shapes moving under black water, rendered with the careful, patient attention of a child who had found, for the moment, something to look at that did not frighten him. "That one's fast," Maya said, watching a particularly large fish cut across the pond in a quick orange flash. "Bet you can't draw him before he moves again." Ji-ho's pencil moved quickly, chasing the fish's shape before it dissolved back into the water's dark surface. And when he looked up at her, something in his face had gone bright in a way she'd been watching build for weeks. Not a smile exactly, Ji-ho did not smile yet, but something adjacent to it, the specific readiness of a child on the edge of wanting to share a joke. "Again," he said. It was one word. It came out slightly hoarse, the sound of a voice that had not been used in 14 months finding its way back through a throat that had nearly forgotten the mechanics of it. And Maya went absolutely still, every clinical instinct she had screaming at her not to react in a way that would frighten him back into silence, not to make it a bigger occasion than it needed to be, even as something enormous and wordless rose up in her own chest at the sound of it. "Again," she agreed, keeping her voice as ordinary as she could make it, and pointed to another fish cutting across the water. "That one. Go." He drew it. He said nothing else that afternoon, but he said again 3 more times before Mrs. Beck called them in for dinner, each time a little steadier than the last, and Maya sat with him through the whole meal afterward with her chest so full of something she didn't trust herself to name yet that she barely tasted her own food, and did not tell anyone what had happened until Seo-jun came home at 8, because some things, she had learned, needed to be delivered directly by the person who'd witnessed them, not passed along secondhand through a household report that would flatten the size of it into a bullet point. She found him in his study and told him plainly, watching his face while she did. Watching a man who had spent 2 decades learning to give nothing away lose, entirely, for the length of one sentence, every bit of that careful architecture, and when she finished, he sat down slowly in the chair behind his desk, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up, and put his face in his hands for a long moment, and Maya stood in the doorway and let him have it, the specific privacy of a grief finally interrupted by something good, because she understood, better than most people would have, that relief could knock a person down just as hard as loss. "Again," he said finally, into his hands, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way she suspected he would have been mortified by in front of almost anyone else in his life, and did not seem to be entirely in front of her. He said again. "He said it 4 times, Maya said. "I think there'll be more. I don't want to promise you a straight line, Mr. Han. Kids like Ji-ho don't usually give you a straight line. There'll be good days and days where it feels like it's gone quiet again, and that doesn't mean it's actually gone, it just means healing isn't linear and nobody ever tells families that part clearly enough. But I think the wall's got a door in it now. That's different than it was 3 weeks ago." "Seo-jun," he said. "What? You've called me Mr. Han for 3 weeks. I'd like you to stop." He said it simply, without the weight she might have expected such a request to carry, and something in the plainness of it. A man asking to be called by his own name, after everything else that had happened that day, landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest that she filed away, quickly to examine later, when she had more room in herself to examine anything at all. "Seo-jun," she said, and he nodded, once, like a small transaction completed, and neither of them said anything else about it, though both of them, in their separate ways, carried the exchange with them for the rest of the evening like a stone warmed by sunlight, pocketed, held onto. The box came out of a storage room on the 3rd floor 4 days later, at Seo-jun's request, delivered to the small sitting room off his study by a member of staff who set it down with the particular careful reverence people reserve for things that clearly matter more than their size suggests, and left without being asked to. "I haven't opened it," Seo-jun said. looking at it the way a man looks at a door he has walked past for 14 months without touching the handle. Her personal things. Not the estate paperwork, not anything the lawyers needed, this is just hers. Books, letters, things from before we married, mostly. Mrs. Beck packed it up 8 months ago because I couldn't stand walking past her closet every morning, and I told her to put it somewhere I wouldn't see it, and then I never asked her where somewhere was, because asking felt like admitting I was ready to look, and I wasn't. He looked at Maya. I don't know why I'm ready now. I think it might be the boy. If he's finding a door in his wall, I don't think I get to keep mine locked much longer without it becoming its own kind of dishonesty toward him. I can leave if you'd rather do this alone. I'd rather you stayed, he said simply and did not elaborate, and Maya sat with him on the floor of the small sitting room while he opened the box, and did not touch anything herself, only handed him things when he reached for them, and said nothing at all through the first 20 minutes, which were mostly books, Korean poetry, a dog-eared paperback on non-profit finance, a university notebook full of dense, careful handwriting, and photographs, a whole envelope of them, Sua at various ages, Sua at their wedding, Sua pregnant, glowing, standing in a garden that Maya recognized with a small jolt, as the same garden 2 floors below them, the koi pond visible in the background, younger, the plantings around it sparser. It was the second envelope of photographs, near the bottom of the box, that stopped Maya's breath entirely. They were older, the paper stock slightly different, the color cast of a camera from an earlier decade, and they showed a much younger Sua 22-23, Maya guessed, doing the math without meaning to. Standing on a narrow street lined with row houses and half-bare sycamores that Maya would have recognized blindfolded, because she had grown up on that exact street, had walked past those exact houses every day of her childhood, and in the third photograph down, Sua stood on the front steps of a row house with her arm around a black woman in her 40s whose face, though younger, though caught mid-laugh in a way Maya had rarely seen it caught in 29 years of being her daughter, was unmistakably, impossibly, her mother's. Maya sat completely still, staring at the photograph, and felt the small cold thread that had coiled at the base of her spine during the phone call 11 days earlier pull suddenly, sharply taut. Maya! Seo-jun had noticed her stillness, was watching her face with the particular attentiveness he'd learned, across 14 months, to bring to any sudden change in the emotional temperature of a room. What is it? She turned the photograph so he could see it properly, her hand not entirely steady. That's my mother, she said. That's my mother's house. I grew up in that house. She looked up at him and watched the specific, dawning confusion on his face resolve, slowly, into something else. Something that looked almost like fear, the fear of a man who suspects he is about to be handed information large enough to reorganize everything he thought he understood about his own life. Seo-jun, my mother told me 11 days ago about a woman who boarded with us when I was a girl. 15, 16 years ago. A woman doing some kind of graduate program, homesick, quiet. My mother used to sing to her, the same song I sang to Ji-ho, the one that's been passed down in my family for generations. She called herself Sarah. My mother never knew her real name. Maya's voice had gone very quiet. I think that's her. I think Sua is Sarah. I think your wife lived in my mother's house. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Maya could hear the koi pond's small fountain running 2 floors below, could hear a car pass on the street outside the wall, could hear, distinctly, the sound of Seo-jun's breathing change as he sat with the specific vertigo of discovering that a wife he had spent 6 years of marriage and 14 months of grief believing he knew completely had carried, quietly, an entire chapter of her life that he had never once heard the full shape of. She told me she studied abroad, he said finally, his voice careful, the words coming slowly, as if he were testing each one before trusting it to hold weight. 2 years, a program in public health and non-profit finance before we met. She said very little about it beyond that. I asked early in our marriage. I remember asking, because I was curious what had shaped a woman who thought about money and corruption the way she did, so differently from anyone else I'd ever known in this world. And she told me it wasn't a happy time to talk about, that she'd gone through something difficult before she left for it and something difficult while she was there, and that she'd rather I know her as who she'd become than spend our marriage picking through who she'd had to survive being first. I respected that. I never pushed. He looked at the photograph in Maya's hand. I didn't know the name of the city. I didn't know there was a woman who sang to her when she was frightened. I didn't know any of this had a shape, Maya. I thought it was just grief before I knew her, private in the way everyone's early 20s are a little private. I never imagined it had a name, a street, a face. There's more, Maya said slowly, an idea assembling itself even as she said it, the specific electric clarity of a pattern coming into focus that she recognized from 100 medical charts, the moment before a diagnosis crystallizes. My mother said something else on that call. She said Sarah kept something with her. She didn't say what exactly. I didn't know to ask, but I remember her saying that a few years after the cards stopped coming, out of nowhere, a package arrived at the house. No note, just Sarah's handwriting on the outside, and inside, my mother said, some documents sealed in an envelope within the package, and a short letter asking her to keep it safe just in case and to not open it unless Sarah herself asked her to, or unless something happened that made it necessary. My mother's kept it in the hallway closet for, God, it must be 6 years now. She mentioned it almost as an afterthought, like it was just one more strange, sentimental thing from a story she liked telling. I didn't think anything of it until right now. Seo-jun's face had gone very still, the specific stillness she had learned, across 3 weeks, to recognize as the version of him that appeared when something large and dangerous was assembling itself behind his eyes faster than his mouth could keep pace with it. What kind of documents? He said quietly. Did she say? No, just documents. Sealed. Maya held his gaze. But Seo-jun, she died 14 months ago. If she sent something to Baltimore for safekeeping years before that, just in case, and never asked for it back, then either she forgot about it entirely, which doesn't sound like a woman careful enough to hide something in the first place, or she never got the chance to ask for it back. Or ask anyone else to. The word hung in the room, unspoken but entirely present between them. Accident, and Seo-jun sat with it for a long moment, his jaw working, the particular effort of a man doing arithmetic he very badly did not want to do, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register Maya had not heard from him before, quiet and precise and cold in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the shape of a suspicion he was only now, for the first time, allowing himself to fully hold. Call your mother, he said. Tonight. Ask her to send it. Whatever it costs, however fast, I don't care. I want that package in this house before the 14th. What's the 14th? The Foundation's quarterly board session. He was already standing, already moving toward the desk, toward a phone he had not touched in the last hour. His mind visibly 3 steps ahead of the conversation they were still having. 6 years ago, Sua asked me a question at a board dinner that I've never fully understood the weight of until this exact moment. She asked why the Foundation's disbursement figures for a shelter program in Incheon didn't match the intake numbers the shelter itself reported publicly. I told her it was probably a reporting lag, an administrative gap, and I let Sangmin handle the follow-up because Sangmin handles every financial question the Foundation generates, has done for 15 years, has never once brought me back a discrepancy he couldn't explain. He looked at Maya, and something in his face had gone somewhere very dark. She never mentioned it again. I assumed she'd accepted the explanation. I never once asked myself whether she'd simply stopped bringing it to me and started looking into it herself instead. Gloria Ellison, informed by phone that evening of the specific, improbable weight suddenly attached to a package she had stored in her hallway closet for 6 years without a second thought, reacted with the particular calm competence of a woman who had spent 61 years absorbing surprising information without letting it visibly rattle her. It's still there, she confirmed. After a brief search Maya could hear through the phone. The sound of a closet door, boxes shifting, her mother's slightly labored breathing from the effort of reaching a high shelf with a body that had, for months ago, forgotten temporarily how to trust its own balance. Brown paper, my name in her handwriting. A little worse for the years, but it's here. You want me to open it? No, Maya said, glancing at Seo-jun, who had come to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him even without looking directly at his face. Don't open it, Mom. Just, is there a courier service near you, something that can move it fast internationally? Mr. Han's arranging to pay for whatever that costs, and he wants it here as quickly as it can physically travel. Maya Renee, what in the world have you gotten yourself into? Gloria's voice had shifted, the warmth still present but sharpened now with the specific alertness of a mother who had spent 29 years learning to hear the difference between her daughter being fine and her daughter saying she was fine. This has something to do with that boy's family, doesn't it? The Korean gentleman. It's a long story, Mom. I promise I'll tell you the whole thing once it's actually finished being a story instead of the middle of one. Right now, I just need you to trust me and get that package moving. A pause, considering, and then, in the tone of a woman deciding to set aside 100 questions she wanted to ask in favor of the one thing that was actually useful in the moment. There's a shipping place 2 blocks over, does international. I've used it before for your Aunt Denise's care packages to her son overseas. I can be there within the hour. A beat. You be careful, baby. I don't know what this is, but I can hear it in your voice, and I raised you not to hide the size of a thing from your own mother, so don't start now. I'll call you as soon as I know more, Maya said, and meant it, and hung up, and turned to find Seo-jun watching her with an expression she couldn't fully parse. Something like gratitude, something like fear, something like the specific vertigo of a man watching 2 entirely separate lives he'd been living turn out, all at once, to have been the same life all along. Oh Sangmin's man reported back on the 4th day of surveillance with information that troubled him more than he let show in his voice on the call. The American had made an international shipping inquiry. A package, inbound from Baltimore, expedited, insured for an amount the sender's local shipping outlet had found unusual enough to flag in their own system, a detail his contact had extracted with the specific ease of a man who had spent 2 decades building relationships with exactly the kind of low-level logistics employees who noticed things and could be persuaded, for a reasonable fee, to mention them to the right person. Sangmin sat with the information for a long moment after the call ended, turning it over with the particular cold precision he brought to every threat assessment he had ever conducted, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific, unfamiliar sensation of the ground beginning to shift beneath a structure he had believed, for 15 years, to be permanently, unshakably settled. He had not thought about the Incheon shelter program discrepancy in years. He had built, in the aftermath of Sua's single, pointed question at that board dinner, a system so thoroughly insulated from scrutiny that the idea of it surfacing again, 6 years later, carried by a package mailed from a row house in Baltimore by a woman his intelligence had confirmed, that same afternoon, had once known Han Sua under an assumed name during a period of her life the chairman himself apparently knew almost nothing about, felt less like a coincidence than like the specific, delayed detonation of something he had believed, wrongly, he'd successfully defused years earlier. He had loved Sua in the particular complicated way a man loves the wife of the son he has effectively raised, not romantically, never that, but with the proprietary watchful affection of someone who had helped build the family she'd married into and had wanted genuinely for her to thrive inside it. He had also understood, within a year of her marriage, that she possessed the one quality he had spent 2 decades ensuring did not exist anywhere near the Baekta Group's actual operations. A forensic, unbudging attention to numbers that did not care whose numbers they were. He had managed her, carefully, for 6 years, the way he managed every variable in Seo-jun's orbit, redirecting her attention, explaining away discrepancies, ensuring that her genuine talent for the Foundation's mission never drifted close enough to its funding mechanisms to see the shape of what actually moved beneath them. He had told himself, in the days after the accident on the coastal road outside Sokcho, that grief had made him imagine connections that weren't there, that a woman who asked a single pointed question at a single dinner 6 years ago and then, by every visible measure, let it go, could not possibly have spent the intervening years quietly building a file. He had told himself that for 14 months. He picked up the phone again. I need the driver's contract from Sokcho pulled, he said, when the call connected, his voice flatter and colder than it had been in years. Not the file, the actual man. I want to know exactly what he remembers about that night, and I want to know before the 14th. The specialist who worked with Jiho twice weekly noted, in her session log the following Thursday, an observation she flagged for the family's attention with more urgency than her usual clinical language typically carried. The patient, unprompted, during a routine drawing exercise, had for the first time in 14 months drawn something other than the car. He had drawn, instead, 2 figures standing beside a pond, one small and one larger, and beside them, in small, careful, still developing handwriting, 2 words in English that he could not, when the specialist gently asked him about them afterward, explain the meaning of, though he seemed to understand on some level beneath language that they mattered. The words were she's safe. Seo-jun read the specialist's note 3 times before he understood, fully, what he was looking at. Not a statement about Maya, though it was certainly that too, but something underneath it, something his son's fractured, patient, still healing mind had apparently been circling for 14 months without the words to land on it directly. A boy who had watched, from the back seat of a car on a wet coastal road, headlights approaching from behind that should not have been there, and who had spent every silent day since trying to find a way to say what he had understood wordlessly, in the last conscious seconds before the world came apart. That the danger had not been an accident at all, that someone had been chasing them, and that some part of him had been waiting ever since for a single safe adult to exist in his life long enough that he could finally, carefully, begin trying to tell them so. The package arrived on the morning of the 12th, 2 days ahead of the board session, delivered by a courier who required 3 separate signatures and a passport check before he would release it, and Seo-jun carried it into his study himself, refusing the offer of any staff member to open it for him, and set it on his desk with the specific care of a man handling something he understood correctly, to be capable of ending a life he had spent 20 years building. Maya sat across from him while he opened it. Ji-ho was with the specialist, safely occupied for the morning, a fact Seo-jun had confirmed twice before allowing himself to sit down at the desk, and Mrs. Beck stood near the door, arms crossed, having appointed herself, without being asked, a kind of witness to whatever the room was about to produce. Inside the outer wrapping was a smaller parcel, and inside that, a sealed manila envelope with Han Sua's handwriting on the front. Not Sarah's handwriting, Maya noticed, but her real name, written in careful English block letters, as though some part of her, even in hiding, had wanted the truth of her own identity preserved somewhere safe, even if the safety required a false name on everything else. Beneath the envelope, folded separately, was a short letter, addressed to Gloria Ellison, dated a little over 6 years earlier, and Seo-jun read it aloud, his voice unsteady in a way Maya had not heard from him before, not even in the garden, not even holding the specialist's note about his son's drawing. Dear Gloria, I hope this finds you well and that Maya is doing beautifully in school, as I'm sure she is. I'm sorry to ask something strange of you after so many years, but I don't have anyone else I trust the way I trusted you. In that kitchen, all those nights you let me sit and be frightened without making me explain why. I found something in my work here that some very powerful people would very much prefer stayed buried, and I don't yet know what I'm going to do about it, but I want it somewhere safe, somewhere no one here would think to look, in case I run out of time to decide. Please don't open it unless something happens to me, or unless I write to you myself and ask for it back. If you never hear from me again about this, you can assume I found another way, and you can throw it away unread, and I'm sorry for the burden either way. Thank you for everything you gave me when I had nothing of my own to give back. Sarah, Sua. The room was silent for a long moment after he finished reading. Mrs. Beck had gone very still by the door. Maya felt something enormous and grief-shaped moving through her chest. For a woman she had never met, who had sat at her mother's kitchen table 16 years ago being frightened without explaining why, and had somehow, impossibly, been right to be. Seo-jun opened the sealed envelope with hands that were, for the first time since Maya had known him, visibly unsteady. Inside were photocopies, bank transfer records, foundation disbursement logs, a set of shell company registrations in the Marshall Islands and Labuan that traced, across 6 patient years of paper trail, a pattern of funds routed through the Baekdu Foundation's charitable disbursements and diverted, in fractional carefully rounded amounts, into accounts that led, eventually through 4 layers of holding companies, to Oh Sang-min. There was also a single handwritten page in Sua's own writing, dated the week before her death, that made the room's temperature drop by several more degrees. I confronted him directly on Tuesday. I told him I had everything going back 6 years, and that I was giving him 30 days to resign quietly, citing health, and to return what he could of the Incheon shelter funds before I brought it to Seo-jun and the board. He did not deny it. He asked me very calmly whether I understood what I would be destroying, not just his career, but the stability of an organization that has kept a fragile peace across 3 territories for 15 years, an organization my own son will one day inherit whether I approve of how it was built or not. I told him that was not my problem to manage, and that I would rather my son inherit something honest and smaller than something enormous and rotten at its foundation. He said he understood. He did not look like a man who understood. I am going to Sakcho this weekend regardless, because Ji-ho has been asking to see the ocean, and I refuse to let one uncomfortable conversation change a single plan I have made for my son's happiness. I will bring this file to Seo-jun myself when we return. Seo-jun set the page down very slowly, and did not, for a long time, say anything at all, and Maya understood, watching him, that she was witnessing the exact moment a man's grief, which had spent 14 months believing itself to be about an accident, reorganized itself in real time around the specific, unbearable knowledge that it had never been an accident to begin with. He did not go to Sang-min directly. He understood, with the particular cold clarity that had made him the youngest chairman in the group's history, that a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of explaining away discrepancies would not be undone by a confrontation he had time to prepare for, and so Seo-jun spent the 2 days before the board session doing the one thing Sang-min himself had taught him across 2 decades, to always do before making a move that could not be taken back. He verified everything, independently, through a forensic accountant he retained personally and had never once mentioned to his own director of operations, a woman in Singapore who had built a career specifically on unwinding the kind of shell structures Sua's file described, and who confirmed within 36 hours that every figure in the handwritten pages matched patterns still visible, faintly, in the Foundation's current filings, patterns that had continued uninterrupted for the 14 months since Sua's death. He also, on the second day, made a quiet call to a detective inspector he had known for a decade, a man who owed him a favor considerably larger than the one he was about to ask, and requested, formally, a re-examination of the accident report from Soksho, specifically the maintenance and inspection history of the vehicle, and the phone records of a specific transport contractor Sang-min had used for years for what the household's internal paperwork described only as logistics support. The board session on the 14th convened at 10 in the morning in the Baekdu Group's Gangnam Tower, 17 floors above the street, in a room with a long glass table and a view of the Han River that no one in attendance would remember looking at, given what happened over the following 40 minutes. Sang-min opened the quarterly report as he always did, with the same crisp, practiced efficiency he had brought to 2 decades of these sessions, and had gotten through perhaps 4 minutes of it before Seo-jun set a single folder on the table, unopened, and asked him to stop. "I'd like to revisit the Incheon shelter disbursement figures," Seo-jun said, in a voice that carried none of the heat the moment might have warranted and all of the flat, patient stillness that Sang-min himself had spent 2 decades teaching him to use. Specifically the discrepancy my wife raised at this same table 6 years ago, which you assured me at the time was an administrative reporting lag. The room went very quiet. Sang-min's face did not change, not immediately, the product of decades of discipline that did not simply evaporate because the ground had shifted, but something in his eyes did, a flicker Seo-jun had learned, across 2 decades of watching him operate, to recognize as the specific moment a man begins recalculating every available exit. "That matter was resolved years ago," Sang-min said evenly. "It wasn't." Seo-jun opened the folder. "It was buried. I have documentation, independently verified in the last 36 hours by an accountant with no connection to this organization, tracing 6 years of diverted disbursements through 4 shell entities to accounts under your control. I also have a handwritten account in my wife's own hand, describing a conversation she had with you 8 days before her death, in which she gave you 30 days to resign and return the funds before she brought this to me directly." He let that sit in the room for a moment, watching the board members around the table go very still, watching 2 decades of Sang-min's carefully constructed authority begin, visibly, to come apart at its seams. "And I have a reopened inquiry, as of this morning, into the maintenance history of my wife's vehicle, and the movements, on the night of the accident, of a transport contractor this organization has used for logistics support for 11 years, under your direct authorization." Sang-min did not move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the polish it had carried for 2 decades, had gone thin and quick in a way Seo-jun had never once heard from him. "You have no idea what you're unraveling," he said. "Everything this family has, every territory this organization holds without a single active conflict in 15 years, exists because I managed things that could not survive daylight. Your wife did not understand that. I loved her, Seo-jun, more than you likely believe, and I gave her every opportunity to walk away from a fight that would have cost her everything, and she would not take it, and I made a choice that night that I have lived with every single day since, and I am not going to sit in this room and pretend I regret protecting an organization that has kept your family alive for 2 decades against people who would have ended all of you the moment they smelled the first sign of weakness. You had her killed." Seo-jun's voice, when it finally broke from its flatness, did so all at once, a wall giving way after 14 months of pressure. My son was in that car, Sang-min. My son. An outcome I did not intend and have regretted every day since, Sang-min said, and for the first time in the entire session, something in his face looked genuinely, completely broken. I told the driver to force the vehicle to stop. Nothing more. A scare. A delay. Enough to buy time for a different conversation. What happened on that road was not the plan. I have carried that failure for 14 months in a silence I could not afford to break, because breaking it would have destroyed the very thing I was trying to protect when it happened. The board session ended, in practical terms, within the hour, though the machinery it set in motion, the detective inspector's formal reopening of the case, the board's emergency session to remove Sang-min from every position of authority he had accumulated across 2 decades, the beginning of a legal process that would eventually see him charged, tried, and convicted months later in a proceeding that made careful, sanitized headlines about corporate fraud and never once mentioned the words Mafia or syndicate because the Baekdu Group's public face had been built, for exactly this contingency, to survive scandal at the level scandal was permitted to reach. Ran for months afterward, in rooms Maya never entered and conversations Seo-jun rarely brought home with him, because he had learned, somewhere in the middle of that terrible, clarifying morning, that there was a version of protecting his son that meant keeping the machinery of consequence as far from the boy's daily life as he could manage, even while making absolutely certain it turned, completely all the way through. Yoo Se-yeon withdrew from any further discussion of a match within the week, delivered through her father's office in a brief, practical statement that made no reference to scandal and needed none, and Seo-jun, reading it, felt nothing beyond a distant, uncomplicated relief, the specific lightness of a door quietly closing on a room he had never wanted to enter in the first place. Ji-ho told in the simplest possible terms a child psychologist could construct, that the men who had caused the accident that hurt his mother had been found, and would never be able to hurt anyone again, and that none of it had ever, for one single second, been his fault to carry. Sat with the information for a long moment in the small soft-walled room at his academy, and then did something his specialist would describe, in her final report on the case, as the most significant single moment of the entire 14-month treatment history. He asked to draw the car one more time. He drew it carefully, headlights, and behind it, the second pair he had drawn hundreds of times across 14 months, and then, watched by his father and his specialist and, at his own specific request, by Maya, he took a fresh sheet of paper and drew the car again, and this time deliberately, with the careful concentration of a boy completing a task he had been waiting a very long time to be strong enough to finish. He did not draw the second pair of headlights at all. He drew, instead, beside the single car, a small sun, and beside the sun, 3 figures standing together, and beneath them, in his careful, still-developing handwriting, one more word: home. He handed the drawing to his father without a word, and Seo-jun, looking at it, found that he could not, for a long moment, make his voice work at all and simply held his son, who let himself be held in a way he had not fully let himself be held in 14 months. And Maya stood in the doorway of the small soft-walled room and did not try to stop the tears on her own face, because some rooms did not call for composure, and this, she understood, watching a father and son finally arrive. Somewhere together was one of them. She told Seo-jun 3 nights later in the garden beside the koi pond that her placement contract technically concluded at the end of the month, that Halcyon's original agreement had been built around an initial 90-day trial, and that she supposed, given everything, they would need to discuss whether to formalize something longer, through the proper channels this time, under her correct name, with all the paperwork Sang-min would have once insisted on filed exactly as it should be. "I don't want a longer contract," Seo-jun said, and something in the plainness of it made her heart do something complicated in her chest before he continued. "I want to ask you something else, and I want you to know you're allowed to say no to it and stay exactly as long as you'd like under whatever arrangement makes sense for you, because nothing about my son's well-being should ever be leveraged against your answer to a separate question." "Ask me the separate question, then," Maya said, and found she was smiling despite the specific vertigo of the moment, despite the ocean between herself and her mother, despite the size and strangeness of everything that had happened in the last 6 weeks. "I don't know how to do this," Seo-jun said, echoing, though he did not know it, a sentence that a version of himself in another telling of a similar story might have said in almost the same words, in almost the same kind of garden, to almost the same kind of woman. "I have spent my whole adult life being extremely good at things that have nothing to do with this. I know how to read a room full of men deciding whether to kill me. I do not know how to tell a woman that I think about her steadiness the entire day, every day, in a way that has nothing to do with my son's recovery, though I am aware that started there and I don't know exactly where the line moved. He looked at her, and the careful executive stillness she'd first met 6 weeks earlier was almost entirely gone from his face, replaced by something rawer, more uncertain, more human. I'm not asking you to decide anything permanent tonight. I'm asking whether there's room in whatever you're building for yourself here, for the possibility of this. Of me. I would understand completely if there isn't. Your life was upended enough by a filing error at an agency office in Baltimore. I don't want to add myself to that list of things you didn't choose. Maya considered this for a long moment, the koi moving slow and orange beneath the dark water, the specific quiet of a garden in a house that had, over 6 weeks, stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling, faintly, dangerously, like it might someday feel like home. I signed the wrong name on a piece of paper because I didn't know how else to walk through a gate that wasn't supposed to open for me, she said finally. Everything since then has been a version of that same choice, over and over. Staying when I should have raised the alarm. Singing when a whole medical establishment fired me for exactly that instinct. Sitting with your son in silence instead of filling it with noise because I trusted what I actually knew instead of what I was supposed to perform. She looked at him. I don't think I know how to be careful about this either, Seo-jun. I think I'm just going to keep doing the thing that feels true and let the paperwork catch up to it eventually, the way it always has. So yes, there's room. Gloria Ellison flew to Seoul in the spring, 5 months later, on a ticket Seo-jun had booked over her mild token protest that it was too much, too far, too extravagant for a woman who had managed a stroke and a row house and a whole life without anyone's help for 61 years, and who found, upon arrival at Incheon, that her son-in-law-to-be. The phrase still made Maya laugh, privately, at its own unlikeliness, a Baltimore row house and a Seoul syndicate chairman folded into one impossible sentence, had sent a car considerably nicer than the one that had once collected Maya under someone else's name, and had come to the airport himself, no driver, no Mrs. Beck, just himself, standing at arrivals with a small boy holding his hand. Ji-ho had insisted on coming. He had insisted, these days, on quite a lot of things, in a voice that had found its full range again over the winter, still careful in the specific way of a child who remembered what it cost to lose it once and did not intend to take having it back for granted. And when Gloria came through the gate, tired and travel-worn and craning to find her daughter's face in the crowd, it was Ji-ho who saw her first, and Ji-ho who let go of his father's hand and walked directly up to a stranger he had never met, in a country she had never visited, and said, with the particular grave formality he'd taken to practicing for exactly this moment, "You're the lady who sang to my mom." Gloria stopped walking. She looked down at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face that Maya, watching from a few steps back, would remember for the rest of her life. The specific, enormous quiet of a woman meeting at 61. The living proof that a small kindness offered to a homesick girl at a kitchen table 16 years ago had traveled further and mattered more than she could have possibly imagined at the time. "I did," Gloria said, crouching down as far as her hip would comfortably allow, her voice thick. "A long time ago. What's your name, baby?" "Ji-ho," he said. "Maya sings it to me now. The same one." "Does she now?" Gloria looked up, found Maya's eyes over the boy's head, and something passed between mother and daughter that needed no further words at all. "Well," she said, straightening carefully, taking the small hand Ji-ho offered her without being asked. "I suppose I should teach you the rest of the verses then. There's more to it than the 6 notes she probably gave you first. Your mama, Sarah, I called her. She only ever learned the first half before she went home. Seems only right somebody finally gets the whole song." They walked out of the terminal that way, Gloria's hand in Ji-ho's, Maya and Seo-jun a few steps behind, and Seo-jun, watching the boy lead a stranger from Baltimore toward the car with the easy, uncomplicated confidence of a child who had decided, the way children sometimes simply decide, that this was a person who belonged in his life, reached over and took Maya's hand without either of them remarking on it, because some gestures had stopped needing announcement months earlier. The Baekdu Foundation reopened its Incheon shelter program in June, fully funded, independently audited, under a new director Seo-jun had hired personally from outside the organization's usual channels, and renamed, at his specific request, the Suwa Center for Family Support, a plaque by the door listing her name and, beneath it, a single line he had written himself and revised 11 times before he was satisfied it was true rather than merely comforting. She asked the question that mattered. We are still answering it. Yoo Se-yeon sent a brief, gracious note when the news of Sangmin's conviction became public in a form the papers could report, wishing Seo-jun well, mentioning, almost as an aside, that she had begun seeing someone from outside either family's business entirely, an architect, and that she had found, to her own considerable surprise, that she preferred it. Seo-jun read the note once, felt a genuine, uncomplicated gladness for her that surprised him a little, and filed it away, and did not think of her again with anything other than that same small, distant warmth. Gloria stayed 6 weeks. She taught Ji-ho the second half of the lullaby, the verses that Sua had never learned, sitting at a kitchen table in a house on Yeonhwi-dong that had, by summer, stopped being a place staff moved through with practiced invisibility and become, slowly, unmistakably, a home with actual noise in it. Ji-ho's laughter, increasingly frequent and increasingly loud in the specific way that made Mrs. Beck pretend to complain about it while visibly delighting in every decibel. Gloria's low, warm voice telling stories about a girl named Sarah who used to sit at her kitchen table being frightened without explaining why. Maya's own voice, restored to a career she'd rebuilt on her own terms, running a small music therapy practice out of a converted room on the estate's ground floor that had, within its first 4 months, a waiting list of families whose children had run out of other doors to try. On a Tuesday evening in late summer, with the koi pond catching the day's last orange light and Gloria back in Baltimore, 3 weeks into a recovery that had somehow, against all clinical expectation, continued improving faster since her return than any of her doctors could fully account for. Maya sat on the garden bench beside Seo-jun and watched Ji-ho attempt, with fierce concentration, to teach a fish that could not hear him the rules of a game he had invented that afternoon involving pebbles and turns and rules that changed depending on which fish surfaced first. "I keep thinking about the paperwork," Maya said, watching the boy crouch at the pond's edge, utterly absorbed, utterly safe. If Halcyon's system hadn't glitched, if Farah hadn't grabbed the wrong folder off the wrong stack that Tuesday, I wonder sometimes what would have happened to him. To all of you. I try not to think about it, Seo-jun admitted. It frightens me more than anything Sangmin ever did. The idea that the entire shape of this, Ji-ho speaking again, Sangmin finally answering for what he did, Sua's own mother, in the truest sense, walking through my son's life again after 16 years. All of it turned on a clerical error at an office park off a highway I've never seen and will probably never see, made by a woman named Farah I will never meet and cannot properly thank. He looked at her. I've built my entire life on the idea that outcomes are the product of careful planning, of controlling every variable before it can control you. I don't know what to do with the fact that the single most important thing that has ever happened to my son happened because someone at an agency pulled the wrong folder off a desk. Maybe that's the actual lesson, Maya said slowly, watching Ji-ho triumphantly declare a fish the winner of a game only he understood the rules to. Not that you can't plan, and not that Sangmin was wrong that vigilance matters, but that you can build every wall you know how to build and verify every name on every form, and the thing that actually saves you still shows up sideways, through the one gap nobody thought to guard, because it was never going to arrive through the front door you were watching so carefully in the first place. Seo-jun was quiet for a long moment, watching his son in the last of the light, and then he reached over and took her hand, the same unremarkable, unannounced gesture that had stopped needing announcement months ago, and said, simply, I signed the wrong name on the intake form. You what? When Mrs. Beck corrected the household file, after your first week. He was almost smiling, the rare, genuine thing that still did something to her chest every time it surfaced. I filled it out myself, since I'd asked for it corrected personally. I wrote your name on the line, and for 1/2 of 1 second before I caught myself, I found I'd started writing something else first. The first letter of a name that wasn't yours, a name I hadn't let myself think in 14 months. I crossed it out. I don't know what to make of that, except that I think some part of me understood, before the rest of me caught up, that you'd walked into this house carrying an old grief forward into a new one, the way Sua, without either of us knowing it, had once carried you and your mother forward into all of this, 16 years before you ever existed to her as anything but a girl in a photograph she never fully explained. Maya said nothing for a moment, only watched the water, watched her son. She had started thinking of him that way, quietly, these last few months, and had not yet said it aloud to anyone, saving it, she suspected, for a moment large enough to deserve it. Declare a second fish the winner of a second, entirely different game, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, at last, without any of the wariness that had followed her across an ocean and a termination letter and a folder with the wrong name on it. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than that. The particular, hard-won quiet of a person who had spent a very long time doing the arithmetic of her own survival, calculating cost against risk, distance against debt, and who had finally, in a garden on the other side of the world from every street she'd ever called home, put the calculator down. Jiho looked up from the pond's edge and called out, in the ordinary, unremarkable voice of a boy who had gotten his whole voice back and intended to use every bit of it. Maya, come see. He wins if he's orange and fast. I made a new rule. Those seem like good rules, she called back and stood, and Seo-jun stood with her, and they walked together toward the water where their son was waiting, in the last good light of a Tuesday that would never make any official record anywhere, that would never appear in a board report or a security log or a file with anyone's name typed at the top of it, correct or otherwise. Just an ordinary evening, unremarkable and entire, the kind that Han Sua once, briefly, impossibly, far from home, and frightened at a stranger's kitchen table, had wanted badly enough for her own son that she had spent the last week of her life risking everything to make sure he might someday get to have it. He had it now. That was the whole of the ending, and it did not need to be any larger than that. A boy at a pond, a woman who had learned his mother's oldest song without knowing it was hers to learn, and a man who had finally stopped mistaking control for safety, standing together in the particular, ordinary light of an evening that was, at long last, simply theirs.